When I stepped off the train, the first thing that hit me was the silence. In the city, there's always some kind of noise. Sirens, people shouting, the hum of traffic that never really stops. But here, in this small Appalachian town, it felt like the world had gone on mute. Just the faint buzz of cicadas somewhere in the trees, and the distant creak of the station's old wooden sign swaying in the breeze. My parents were waiting for me by the car. I hadn't seen them in almost a year, not since they sold our old house and moved out here to the middle of nowhere. My mom hugged me like it had only been a week, all cheerful and warm, while my dad gave me his usual firm pat on the back. "Look at you," Mom said, stepping back to study me like I was some kind of project. "The big city has been good to you, huh?" "Yeah," I mumbled, throwing my duffel in the trunk. "It's different." Dad laughed as we pulled out of the parking lot. "Bet it's not as peaceful as this, though." He wasn't wrong, but the kind of peace they had out here didn't feel right to me. The drive to their new house took nearly 40 minutes. The road twisted through thick forests, past broken-down barns and abandoned gas stations with rusted-out pumps. Occasionally, we'd pass a house. Some of them looked lived in, others like they'd been swallowed by the woods decades ago. I stared out the window, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. "So," Dad said after a while, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "How's school? City treating you well?" "It's fine," I said, not really in the mood for small talk. "Busy." "You're always busy in the city," Mom chimed in, smiling. "Out here, you'll finally get a chance to breathe." Breathe. Yeah, right. Out here, it felt like the trees were pressing in, squeezing the air out of my lungs. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I just stared at the house. It was bigger than our old one, with a wide front porch and dark green shutters. But there was something about it that felt off. Maybe it was the way the woods loomed just a little too close, or how the windows reflected nothing but the darkening sky. "Well," Mom said, getting out of the car. "What do you think?" I forced a smile. "It's nice." But inside, I was already counting down the days until I could leave. By the third day, I was on the verge of losing my mind. My parents left for work early in the morning and wouldn't get back until late evening. Their jobs were in town, a good 30-minute drive from the house, which meant I was stuck here with no car, no decent Wi-Fi, and barely any cell reception. I'd burned through the few offline games I had on my phone, and even the books I brought started to feel like homework. I wandered the house, hoping I'd missed something interesting, maybe an old board game or even a deck of cards. But there was nothing. Just the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional creak of the house settling. Even the air felt still, like the place itself was holding its breath. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I found my old bike in the garage, covered in a thin layer of dust but still in decent shape. The tires were flat, but Dad had a pump on his workbench. It took some effort, but eventually, the wheels were good to go. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and set off, figuring I'd at least get a better sense of the area. The road out of our neighborhood was cracked and uneven, lined with thick trees on either side. It wasn't like riding through the city, where there's always something happening. Cars honking, people yelling, street performers doing their thing. Here, it was just me, the crunch of gravel under my tires, and the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. After about an hour of aimless pedaling, I found a narrow path branching off from the road. The entrance was easy to miss, just a gap between two old trees, with a wooden sign that had long since faded to gray. Curiosity got the better of me. I veered off the road, following the path as it wound deeper into the woods. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. At first, it was peaceful, the kind of quiet my parents probably loved. But after a while, it started to feel unnatural, like the woods were watching me. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But then I heard it, a low, melodic whistling. It wasn't loud, just a faint tune, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the woods. I stopped, straining to hear it better. It wasn't any song I recognized, just a simple, repetitive melody. I figured it was probably another hiker, or maybe some local out for a walk. But when I called out, just a quick, "Hello?" the whistling stopped. I waited, expecting to hear footsteps or maybe a voice calling back, but there was nothing, just silence. I shook it off and kept riding. Probably just some weirdo who didn't feel like talking. No big deal. But as I rode further up the trail, the whistling started again, closer this time, and coming from a different direction. The whistling drifted through the trees again, soft, slow, and steady. But now it wasn't coming from behind me. It was off to the left, deeper in the woods, like someone had moved while I was riding. I scanned the trees, trying to spot whoever it was, but the woods were too dense. Shadows clung to the trunks, and the sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy overhead. I listened hard, straining to hear footsteps, twigs snapping, anything. But there was only that damn whistling, weaving through the trees like it had a mind of its own. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a hunter or a hiker. People out here like to keep to themselves, right? But even as I tried to rationalize it, the unease curled tighter in my chest. I gripped the handlebars and kept moving, pushing the bike uphill. The trail grew steeper, and the trees closed in around me, their branches arching overhead like twisted fingers. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the path behind me was empty. The whistling faded again. For a second, I thought maybe they'd gone, that I was finally alone. But then it came back, closer, and this time, from the right. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. It didn't make sense. No one could move that fast through these woods, not without making some kind of noise. The underbrush was thick, the ground uneven. I should have heard branches snapping, leaves rustling, something. But there was nothing. Just that eerie, lilting tune, floating through the trees like it belonged there. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep going. I wasn't about to let some random hiker or whatever it was freak me out. I'd reach the summit, take a look around, and head back before it got dark. That was the plan anyway. But the whistling had other ideas. It took another 20 minutes of climbing before the trail finally leveled out. My legs burned and sweat clung to my back, but I pushed through until the trees thinned and the summit came into view. The top wasn't much, just a small clearing with a half-rotted bench facing the valley below. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I dropped my bike near the bench and sat down, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The view was beautiful, I guess. Rolling hills fading into the distance, the treetops painted gold by the setting sun. I could almost forget about the weirdness on the trail. Almost. Then I heard it again. The whistling. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far down the slope. But it grew louder, clearer, as if whoever, or whatever, was climbing up after me. The tune hadn't changed. It was the same simple melody, slow and deliberate, like it was waiting for a response. And for some reason, I gave it one. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was trying to prove to myself that it was just another person, that there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe I was just tired of feeling like prey. Whatever the reason, I puckered my lips and whistled back, mimicking the same tune, note for note. The sound barely left my lips before the entire forest fell silent. Not just the whistling. Everything. The birds stopped. The wind died. Even the leaves, which had been rustling gently in the breeze, went still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. A chill crept up my spine, cutting through the sweat on my skin. I stood up, scanning the tree line, waiting for something, anything, to move. But there was nothing. just silence. And then, "Hi." The voice came from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded in shadow. An old woman. Tall. Taller than any woman I'd ever met. Her long white hair hung in thin, tangled strands over her shoulders. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, but deeply wrinkled around her mouth and eyes. And those eyes, gray, almost colorless, locked onto mine like she could see straight through me. She smiled, revealing crooked yellow-brown teeth. "Hi," she said again, the same flat tone, like she was practicing the word. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my pulse hammered in my ears. Hey," I managed, my voice sounding way too small in the heavy silence. She took a step closer. The movement was smooth. Too smooth for someone her age. Her feet barely seemed to touch the ground. "What's your name?" Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it, like the words didn't fit right in her mouth. I forced a laugh, stepping back. I should probably get going. It's getting late." She didn't move, just stood there smiling. But her eyes, those cold gray eyes, never stopped watching me. I grabbed my bike, my hands slick with sweat. Her smile widened. "I asked you," she said, her voice dropping just a little. "What's your name?" I didn't answer. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I just started pedaling. The first few minutes of my descent were a blur. I gripped the handlebars so tight my knuckles went white, the bike rattling over the uneven trail as I barreled downhill. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud enough to drown out every other sound in the forest, until it didn't. Until I heard it again. The whistling. Soft at first, barely audible over the crunch of my tires against the dirt. But it was there. That same eerie tune, floating through the trees like a shadow. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty trail behind me, winding through the trees like a snake. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that my brain was playing tricks on me, still freaked out from that woman at the summit. But the sound wasn't in my head. It was out here, with me. And it was getting closer. The melody drifted from the left, then the right, then directly behind me, shifting like whoever, or whatever, was moving through the woods alongside the trail. But no footsteps followed, no rustling leaves, just that damned whistling, growing louder with each turn of the path. I pedaled harder, the front wheel bouncing dangerously off rocks and roots. But I didn't care. I just needed to get out of these woods. I needed to get home. But no matter how fast I went, the whistling kept pace, like it knew I couldn't escape. The trail twisted and dipped through the trees, every turn looking the same as the last. My legs burned from pedaling, but I didn't dare slow down. The whistling was still there, weaving through the forest like it was part of the wind, but sharper, more deliberate. I glanced at the sky. The sun was sinking fast, turning the tops of the trees a dark orange, while everything below fell into shadow. The woods felt alive now, like they were pressing in on me, waiting for the last bit of light to vanish. I fumbled for my phone, pulling it out of my pocket with one hand while steering with the other. My thumb hovered over Dad's number, ready to call him, to beg him to come pick me up. I didn't care how ridiculous it sounded. I just wanted out of these woods. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. No service. Not a single bar. Just the mocking little words in the corner of the screen. I stopped pedaling for a second, letting the bike coast as I stared at the phone, hoping it was some kind of glitch. I turned in a slow circle, trying to find a signal. Any signal. Nothing. The whistling didn't stop. It drifted through the trees, closer now, like it was circling me. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, my hands shaking, and pushed off again, harder this time. My mind raced with excuses. Maybe it was just a hiker messing with me. Maybe it was some local playing a prank. But no matter how many times I tried to reason it out, the knot in my stomach kept tightening. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. And I was completely alone. The trees thinned, and I knew I was close. The trail's final bend opened into the small clearing where the faded trail marker stood. My chest tightened with relief, but I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just shot toward the clearing like my life depended on it. Because maybe it did. I finally reached the bottom of the trailhead, my legs burning as I tried to slow down. But the turn leading back to the main road came up faster than I expected. I skidded into it, losing control, and the bike tipped out from under me. I hit the ground hard, pain flashing through my side, but there was no time to assess the damage. I scrambled to my feet, yanked the bike upright, and swung my leg over the frame. I sat down, started pedaling. Nothing. I glanced down and groaned. The chain had slipped off the crankset. Frustrated, I kicked down the stand and dropped to my knees, fumbling to get the chain back on the teeth. My fingers were slick with sweat, trembling with adrenaline. That's when I heard it. Not the whistling. A voice. Her voice. "You're leaving already?" I froze. "Where are you going?" The words floated out from the tree line, soft and almost playful, like she was amused. I turned, slowly, my breath caught in my throat. She was there. Standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, her tall frame blending with the darkening woods. Her long white hair hung limp around her face, and those gray eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, locked onto mine. They glowed faintly in the dying light, like they were reflecting something that wasn't there. She smiled, wide and crooked, her yellow-brown teeth catching what little light was left. I was frozen, my mind blank. How the hell did she get down here so fast? I had a bike. She didn't. This shouldn't be possible. Her head tilted slightly like she was studying me. "Ryan," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. I never told her my name. That's when my body finally snapped out of its frozen state. I didn't respond. Didn't waste another second. I jammed the chain back onto the crankset, my hands shaking. Swinging my leg over the bike, I pedaled, hard. My legs burned with every push, but I didn't care. I refused to look back. I didn't want to know if she was still there. Or worse, if she wasn't. The bike wobbled as I tore down the dirt road, my legs pumping harder than they had on the entire way up. Gravel crunched under the tires, slipping out from beneath me with every sharp turn. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The trees on either side blurred into streaks of green and black as I flew past, the wind whipping against my face. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Almost everything. Because even over the sound of my racing pulse and the groan of my bike's old gears, I could still hear it. The whistling. It wasn't loud anymore. It had faded, like it was staying behind in the woods where it belonged. But it was still there, somewhere in the back of my mind, curling around my thoughts like smoke. The melody was etched into my brain, every note vibrating in my skull with each rotation of the wheels. I kept pedaling, even when my thighs burned and my chest felt like it was about to cave in. The familiar sights of the outskirts of town started to appear. The abandoned gas station with its rusted-out pumps, the sagging porch of a house that looked like it hadn't seen life in years. But none of it brought the relief I thought it would. Because what if she was still following me? What if she was already here, waiting? The thought made me pedal even faster. By the time I finally saw our driveway, my whole body felt like it was about to give out. I shot up the gravel path, ditched the bike on the front lawn, and sprinted to the porch. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys twice before finally getting the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, leaning against the cool wood as I gasped for breath. The house was quiet. Too quiet. But at least I was inside. At least there was a door between me and whatever the hell that woman was. I locked the door. Then I locked it again, twisting the deadbolt so hard I thought it might snap. Only then did I let myself breathe. But the whistling? It was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, like it didn't need to be heard to exist. By the time my parents got home, the sun had fully set, and the house was bathed in that dim, bluish light that made every shadow feel like it was hiding something. I waited until after dinner to tell them. I figured they'd take it more seriously if I didn't blurt it out the second they walked through the door. But when I finally did, sitting at the kitchen table, my heart still thudding in my chest, they didn't react the way I hoped they would. Mom chuckled, shaking her head as she rinsed dishes in the sink. "Sounds like you ran into one of the locals," she said. "People out here can be a little eccentric." Eccentric? I stared at her. Mom, she followed me. She knew my name. Dad didn't even look up from his plate, just speared another bite of his casserole. "Probably just a nosy neighbor. You're not used to how folks are out here. They like to know who's in their neck of the woods." She wasn't just curious, I snapped, louder than I meant to. There's something wrong with her. She was... I don't know. Something is off with her. That got Dad's attention. He finally set down his fork and looked at me, his expression somewhere between annoyance and concern. "Ryan, you're 19 years old. You need to stop letting your imagination run wild. You're not a kid anymore." "I'm not imagining this." I slammed my hand on the table, the sound echoing through the kitchen. The room went quiet. Mom sighed, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to me. "Sweetheart, I know being out here feels different, but you've been living in a big city. You're used to noise, people everywhere. It's natural to feel a little on edge in a quiet place like this." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Because what was the point? They weren't going to believe me. Not until they saw her for themselves. And part of me hoped they never would. I pushed back from the table and stood up. "I'm done talking with you people. I'm going to bed." Dad muttered something under his breath about me overreacting, but I didn't care. I just climbed the stairs 2 at a time, shut my bedroom door, and locked it. But even behind that locked door, with the faint hum of my parents' voices downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that she was still out there. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been some weird dream. But the tension in my chest the second I opened my eyes told me otherwise. It wasn't just a dream. She had been there. I'd seen her eyes glowing in the trees, heard her voice calling after me. I spent the day trying to shake it off. My parents were back at work, and I was alone again, trapped in the quiet of the house. I thought about going for another ride, but the idea of getting anywhere near those woods made my skin crawl. Instead, I stuck to the porch, flipping through an old magazine I wasn't really reading, my eyes darting toward the tree line every few minutes. That's when I heard it again. At first, I thought it was in my head, that melody that had been burned into my brain since the trail. But as I sat there holding my breath, I realized it wasn't my imagination. The whistling was faint, coming from somewhere far off in the woods. I stood up slowly, the magazine slipping from my lap onto the porch. My heart hammered in my chest, and I strained to listen, waiting to see if it would fade. But it didn't. It grew louder, closer. I backed up, slipping inside the house and locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the day jumping at every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge. Every little noise felt like it could be her. It didn't stop after that. Over the next few days, the whistling followed me. When I was in the shower, I'd hear it faintly over the running water. At night, when the house was dark and silent, I'd wake up convinced it was coming from just outside my window. But the worst was when I went into town. I was at the grocery store, wandering the aisles aimlessly, trying to convince myself to feel normal. I passed the end of one aisle and froze, because there, just for a second, I saw her. Standing at the far end of the aisle, near the frozen foods. Her long white hair hung over her shoulders, and those gray eyes were fixed on me. She wasn't smiling this time, just staring. I blinked, and she was gone. I rushed to the end of the aisle, scanning the store, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd melted into the crowd, or maybe she'd never been there at all. But I knew better. She was following me, and she wasn't going to stop. I wasn't sure why I thought anyone in town would have answers. Maybe I was hoping for someone to say, "Oh yeah, that's just old Mrs. So-and-so, she's harmless." Or even, "Yeah, we know about her, stay away." Anything would have been better than feeling like I was going crazy. The next day, I biked into town. I stuck to the main roads, away from the woods, keeping my eyes on the tree lines the whole time. The sun was high, and the streets were quiet, like the whole town was taking a nap. I stopped at the gas station first. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Dusty shelves, flickering fluorescent lights. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged guy with a thick beard and a trucker hat that read, "Best Buckin' Dad." He was flipping through a hunting magazine, barely glancing up when I walked in. I grabbed a soda from the cooler just to have an excuse to talk. At the counter, I cleared my throat. "Hey, quick question." The guy raised an eyebrow like I was interrupting something real important. "I was out near the old trailhead a few days ago," I started, trying to sound casual. "Ran into this woman. Tall, white hair, gray eyes. Kinda off, you know?" The clerk's expression didn't change, but his hand paused on the page he was flipping. I pressed on. "You know anyone like that around here?" For a second, I thought he might actually answer. But then he just snorted, shook his head, and muttered, "Plenty of weirdos around these parts." That was it. No follow-up, no curiosity. Just like that, the conversation was over. I tried the diner next. The waitress there looked like she'd been working the same tables for decades. Faded blue uniform, hair piled high in a messy bun. I ordered a coffee I didn't want and waited until she came back with the pot before asking, "Hey, I'm staying with my parents out by Hollow Creek Road," I said. "I saw this woman the other day. Older, real tall, long white hair. You know her?" I ran into her on a trail at the top of one of the foothills. The waitress's smile faltered just a bit. Her eyes flicked toward the front windows, then back to me. For a moment, I thought she might actually say something. But then she just shrugged. "Don't know anyone like that," and walked away. It was the same everywhere I went. The people in this town either genuinely didn't know who she was, or they did know and didn't want to talk about it. But the weirdest part? It wasn't just indifference. A few people gave me these looks, quick glances like they were sizing me up, like they were waiting to see what I'd say next, or what I'd do. By the time I left town and started biking home, the knot in my stomach had doubled in size. Because now it wasn't just her that had me on edge. It was everyone. That night I was alone again. Mom had some late meeting in town, and Dad had been called in to help a buddy fix something at the hardware store. They both drove together and promised they'd be back before it got too late, but honestly, I wasn't holding my breath. The house felt different when it was empty. Bigger, like the walls stretched further away from me, like there was too much space for just one person. Every creak and groan of the old wood sounded like footsteps in the next room. I tried to drown it out with YouTube videos, cranking the volume on my laptop as I lay on my bed, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. It was almost 9 when I heard it again. The whistling. This time it wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It was right outside. I froze, my hand hovering over the keyboard. The video kept playing, some mindless vlog, but I didn't hear a word of it. The whistling cut through everything, sharp and clear. The same melody, always the same. Slowly, I reached over and paused the video. For a moment, the house was dead silent. And then, clear as day, the whistling started again, just beneath my window. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. My room was on the second floor, facing the woods behind the house. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. Not this close, not at this hour. But the whistling kept going, like it was daring me to look. I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed to stay put, to pretend I didn't hear it. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me to the window. I pulled the curtain back, just a sliver. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the dark line of the trees, swaying gently in the night breeze. The moonlight spilled through the branches, casting long, twisted shadows across the backyard. For a second, I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Then I saw them. Two faint glowing eyes deep in the tree line. They weren't animal eyes. I knew that immediately. They were too high off the ground, too steady, and they were staring directly at me. The moment I saw them, the whistling stopped. But the eyes didn't blink. They just watched. I slammed the curtain shut and stumbled back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My skin felt cold, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the room. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the closed curtain, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the only sound in the house was my own ragged breathing, until the whistling started again. Closer this time. The moment the whistling started again, I snapped into action. I didn't even think. My body just moved. I bolted out of my room, slamming the door behind me like that thin piece of wood could keep her out. My footsteps echoed through the house as I sprinted down the hall. First stop, the upstairs hallway window. The whistling followed me, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just outside anymore. It felt like it was wrapping around the house, slithering through the walls. My hands trembled as I yanked the curtain shut, but the second the fabric fell into place, the sound shifted. It was sharper now, more insistent, like it was angry. I flew down the stairs two at a time, my breath ragged in my throat. The living room was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the floor. I sprinted to the big front window and yanked the curtain shut, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might drown out the whistling. But it didn't. The melody only got louder. It was in front of the house now. I darted into the kitchen, slamming the curtains closed over the sink window. The whistling shifted again, circling me, like it knew where I was, like it was toying with me. Every curtain I closed only made it worse. The walls felt like they were closing in, the house shrinking with every step I took. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I yanked the final curtain shut in the dining room, and for a moment, just a brief, terrifying moment, the whistling stopped. My chest heaved as I stood there in the dark, the house suffocatingly silent. Then the doorbell rang. Once, twice, 3 slow, deliberate chimes. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, each ring sinking deeper into my chest like a weight pressing down on my ribs. I didn't move at first. I stood frozen in the dining room, staring at the front door as if it might explode off its hinges. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was my parents. Maybe they'd forgotten their keys. But deep down, I knew better. I knew who it was. The same way you know when someone's staring at you from across a room. I backed into the kitchen, my eyes flicking to the knife block on the counter. My fingers closed around the largest one, the cold metal sliding free with a soft scrape. The weight of it in my hand was both comforting and terrifying. I tucked it into the waistband of my jeans, pulling my shirt down to hide it, just in case. The doorbell rang again. slower this time. I crept toward the front door, my footsteps silent on the hardwood. The house felt too quiet, like even the walls were holding their breath. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something told me that wouldn't work. Swallowing hard, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. Just a crack. An old woman stood there, tall and thin, her long white hair tangled around her shoulders. Her skin looked like parchment stretched too tight over sharp bones. But it was her eyes that froze me, cold, gray, and faintly glowing in the dark. And that smile, wide and crooked, revealing yellow and brown teeth. "Ryan," she said softly, like greeting an old friend. "You never told me your name. I had to find out the hard way." My throat closed up. I couldn't speak. She tilted her head, her gaze dropping to my waist. "You don't need that knife, Ryan," she whispered. "What do you plan on doing with it?" My breath hitched. "You want to hurt me with it, Ryan?" she asked, stepping closer. Her smile never wavered. "You won't be able to." I slammed the door shut without another thought, locking it and backing away quickly. But she didn't knock again. Instead, I heard a soft, eerie whistling, a twisted melody that scraped against my nerves. The sound circled the house, moving from window to window like she was looking for another way in. Then it stopped. Silence. I barely had time to process it before the doorknob rattled violently. She was trying to force her way inside. The door shook under her weight, each impact sending vibrations through the floor. I backed away further, my heart slamming against my ribs. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. I listened, my breath caught in my throat. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were moving around the side of the house. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, my breath ragged. Behind me, I heard the sound of a window shattering, glass spraying across the floor. "Let me in, Ryan." Her voice sliced through the house like a blade, high-pitched and shrill, layered with something inhuman. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, pressing my back against the wood. The room felt too small, the air thick and heavy. Downstairs, I heard her footsteps. She was inside. The sound of her dragging something sharp. Fingernails? Claws? Along the walls echoed up the stairs. She was coming. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, slow and deliberate. She wanted me to hear every step, to know there was no escape. She stopped outside my door. The doorknob rattled once, then again. "Ryan." Her voice was softer now, almost a whisper, but it cut through the door like a knife. "You forgot to let me in." The knob twisted slowly, turning all the way, only held in place by the flimsy lock. The wood creaked as pressure built on the other side. I reached for the knife in my waistband, my fingers closing around the handle so tightly they ached. Then, bam! The door jolted in its frame as she slammed her weight against it. I screamed, shoving back with all my strength, but she was strong, too strong. The door rattled violently, the lock threatening to snap. "Let me in, Ryan," she hissed. "Let me in." Her voice was a twisted, guttural snarl now, layered with something inhuman. The door shuddered as her fingers slipped through the crack she'd forced, her long, bony hand reaching for me. Without thinking, I plunged the knife into her hand, pinning it to the doorframe. She didn't scream. She roared, a sound so deep and primal it shook the entire house. The walls trembled, the floor vibrated beneath my feet, and the windows rattled in their frames. The noise was like every nightmare I'd ever had was screaming all at once. I felt a sudden warmth down my leg, but I didn't let go of the knife. Her hand twitched violently, the tendons pulling against the blade. But there was no blood, no sign she even felt the wound. Her other hand slammed against the door, prying it open wider despite the knife. "Let me in, Ryan," she shrieked, the sound tearing through me like glass. I was losing. She was stronger, and she wasn't going to stop. Her hand twitched once, then twice, and with a sickening, wet pop, she yanked it free from the doorframe. The knife went with it. I stumbled backward, tripping and crashing against the dresser. She wasn't bleeding. The knife had sunk deep. I'd felt it. But she pulled it out like it was nothing. And now she had it. The door swung wider, creaking as her shadow stretched across the floor. I saw her face again, peering through the crack. That smile was still there, stretched wider now, as if the pain had only made her hungrier. Her gray eyes glowed faintly, locked onto mine. "Ryan," she whispered, voice sweet and rotten. "You can't hide." I don't remember standing up. One second I was on the floor, and the next I was diving under the bed. My heart pounded in my ears as I squeezed myself into the narrow space, pressing my body against the cold hardwood. Dust clung to my skin, but I didn't dare move. I could hear her footsteps, light and quick, like she wasn't even touching the ground, moving around the room. The door creaked wider as she entered, and the faint glow from the hallway stretched across the floor. Her shadow distorted, long and unnatural, sweeping past the edges of the bed frame. I held my breath. The whistling started again, but this time it was softer, closer, right above me. The mattress dipped slightly, like she was sitting down, her weight pressing into the springs. I could see her feet dangling just inches from my face, long skeletal toes curling and uncurling, the skin dry and peeling in ragged strips. Her toenails, thick and discolored with fungus, twisted like rotting talons, hovering above the floor as if they might reach down and grab me. "Ryan." Her voice was a low whisper now, sweet and sickly. "You can't hide from me." I clutched the knife tighter in my hand, my knuckles white. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I was trapped. If I moved, she'd see me. If I stayed, she'd find me. The mattress creaked again as she leaned forward, her fingers trailing along the floorboards, just inches from where I lay. I could feel the air shift with every movement, the cold breath of her presence brushing against my skin. Her feet dangled just inches from where I lay, crammed beneath the bed, barely daring to breathe. Long, bony toes flexed and stretched against the floorboards, the skin dry and cracked like old parchment. Her thick, yellowed toenails tapped rhythmically, a slow, deliberate sound that felt less like movement and more like thinking. Then, I heard it. The faintest sound. Tires crunching on gravel. The low, familiar hum of an engine easing into the driveway. Her feet froze mid-motion. She stood perfectly still, as if the sound had pierced through her, anchoring her in place. For one long, excruciating moment, time itself seemed to stop. I could almost hear the silence pressing against my ears. Then, without warning, her feet spun sharply toward the window. I heard the faint rattle of glass, the groan of the old frame as it slid open, and the soft scrape of her feet slipping out into the night. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. My breath felt trapped in my chest, too heavy to let out, too fragile to hold in. And then, the whistling started again, soft, shrill, and haunting. But this time, it was moving away, fading into the distance until it dissolved into the night. Still, I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Every creak of the house felt like it was right above me. Every shifting shadow under the bed felt like it might reach out and pull me into the darkness. Then finally, I heard it. The car door slammed shut. My parents were home. I crawled out from under the bed, my body still shaking, and crept to the window. Peeking through the curtains, I saw my parents' car parked in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the night. The beams stretched across the yard, casting long, twisted shadows that clung to the trees and crept along the empty yard. I rushed out of my room, my footsteps echoing in the now eerily quiet house. The hallway was empty, but it felt different, like whatever had been here was gone, for now. I flew down the stairs just as the front door creaked open. "Ryan?" Mom's voice called into the dark house. "Why are all the lights off?" I didn't answer. I just ran straight to them, nearly knocking into my dad as he stepped inside. They both froze when they saw me. I must have looked like hell, sweat-soaked, wild-eyed, and still shaking. "What the hell happened?" Dad asked, his voice sharp. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. I could barely get them out, my mouth dry and my mind still racing. She was here," I gasped. "The woman, from the woods. She tried to get in." Mom's eyes widened, but not with fear, with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she asked, glancing at Dad like this was some joke I was playing. "I'm serious," I snapped, my voice rising. "She was here. She broke a window. She tried to—" I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't even want to say it out loud. "She tried to get me." Dad's face hardened. He pushed past me and walked toward the living room window, the one I knew she had shattered. He yanked back the curtain, expecting to see shards of glass or signs of forced entry. I followed him, my heart pounding. I knew what I'd seen. I knew she'd forced her way in. But when I looked at the window, there was nothing. No cracks, no shattered glass, no sign that anything had happened. It was like she'd never been here at all, except for one thing. My stomach clenched into knots as I bolted outside, eyes darting across the porch, the yard, the shadowed tree line. But everything was still. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, waiting. I forced myself back inside, my heart pounding against my ribs. The gouge in the upstairs doorframe, the one where I'd stabbed her, was still fresh in my mind. I turned to them, my voice trembling. "Come upstairs. I'll show you." They followed, their footsteps heavy behind me as I led them to the scarred wood. I pointed to the deep groove, expecting— I don't know what I expected. Shock? Belief? But when they looked at each other, it wasn't fear I saw in their eyes. It was that quiet, unspoken concern. The kind you reserve for someone who's slipping. Their worry wasn't about what I said happened. It was about me. They flicked on all the lights in the upstairs hallway, searching for any hint that my story held weight. That's when we saw it. The knife. It lay in the far corner, almost like it had been tossed there. She must have thrown it when she yanked it out. My dad picked it up carefully, inspecting it. The tip was snapped clean off. But there was no blood. Not a single drop. Neither of them said a word. The silence clung to us like a fog as we descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. "You're telling me this," he said, nodding toward the knife, "is from some crazy woman who broke into our house?" I stabbed her," I stammered, my voice weak even to my own ears. "In the doorframe. She didn't bleed. She just took it." My mom's face pulled into a worried frown, but not the kind of worry I needed. It was the look you give someone you think is losing their mind. "Ryan," she said softly, like she was talking to a child. "I think maybe you've been under a lot of stress, with school and everything. Maybe your mind just—" "I'm not imagining this," I shouted, my voice cracking. "She was here. She knew my name." Dad shook his head, stepping back inside. "Jesus, Ryan, you're 19 years old. You've got to stop acting like a damn child." I stood there, clutching the broken knife, my heart sinking deeper with every word. They didn't believe me. They were never going to believe me. And that terrified me more than anything else, because I knew she wasn't done, not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night. Even with my parents home, even after checking every lock on every door and window twice, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching, waiting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. That crooked smile. Those gray eyes that seemed to glow even in the dark. And the sound, the whistling, kept replaying in my head, looping endlessly until it felt like it was burrowing into my skull. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I waited until my parents left for work. They were still giving me those sideways glances, like they were waiting for me to admit I'd made the whole thing up. But I didn't say anything. I just nodded when they reminded me to lock the doors behind them, and the second their car disappeared down the road, I grabbed my phone. It took 3 tries for my hands to stop shaking enough to dial. When my friend Mark picked up, his voice was groggy, probably still half asleep. But I didn't care. "Mark," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder like she might be in the room with me. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end, then a yawn. "Dude, it's like 8 in the morning. What's going on?" "I can't stay here," I said, my voice low and frantic. Something's wrong here. I need to get out. Can I crash at your place for the rest of the summer?" That woke him up. "Wait, what? What do you mean something's wrong? Are you okay?" I hesitated, debating how much to tell him. How much would he even believe? "I'll explain when I get there," I said quickly. I need to leave. Today." Mark was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Yeah, man, of course. Come by whenever. I'll clear out the guest room." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I still had to get there. I spent the rest of the morning shoving my stuff back into my duffel bag, barely able to keep my hands steady. Every time I passed a window, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, like I was being watched. I kept expecting to hear that whistling again, faint and distant, curling around the corners of the house. But there was nothing. And somehow that was worse. When my parents got home that evening, I was waiting for them by the door, my bag slung over my shoulder. They both froze when they saw me, their faces a mix of surprise and disappointment. "I'm leaving," I said before they could say anything. "Mark said I can stay with him for the rest of the summer." Dad's jaw clenched. "Ryan, I'm not safe here," I snapped, louder than I meant to. "You don't believe me, fine. But I know what I saw, and I'm not staying another night in this house." Mom's face softened, but there was still that look in her eyes, the one that said she thought I was being ridiculous. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "this isn't like you. You're just stressed. Maybe you should talk to someone." "I did," I cut her off. "Mark. And he believes me." That wasn't exactly true, but it didn't matter. I wasn't staying here to argue about it. Dad sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're 19, Ryan. You're old enough to make your own choices. But don't come running back when you realize this was all in your head." I didn't respond. I just walked past them, out the door, and down the driveway. Because no matter what they thought, I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't in my head. And she wasn't finished with me yet. The train station was a few towns over, and getting there felt like the longest car ride of my life. My parents drove me in strained silence, the tension hanging thick between us. I stared out the window the whole way, watching the trees blur past, my stomach twisting tighter with every mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was nearby, hidden just out of sight, waiting for her chance. When Dad finally pulled into the station's gravel lot, he didn't even turn off the engine. Mom reached back and squeezed my shoulder, offering a weak smile like that would somehow make everything better. "You know you can come home whenever you want," she said softly. "We're always here." I nodded, but I couldn't meet her eyes. I didn't want to see that mix of pity and disbelief again. I grabbed my bag, mumbled a quick, "Thanks," and climbed out of the car without looking back. The station was small, just a single platform with a rusted metal awning and a cracked bench. The paint on the ticket booth was peeling, and the place smelled faintly of mildew and engine grease. It felt like the kind of place time had forgotten. I checked the schedule. My train was running a few minutes late. Of course. I found an empty spot on the bench and sat down, my bag at my feet. The platform was mostly deserted, save for a few people scattered around, lost in their own worlds, headphones in, eyes glued to their phones. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the tracks. For a while, everything felt normal. But then I felt it. That prickle at the back of my neck. The same one I'd felt in the woods. The same one I'd felt outside my window. I looked up, and that's when I saw her. Across the tracks, standing on the opposite platform, partially hidden in the shadow of the station's awning. It was her, the old woman. She was wearing the same clothes from the night she'd tried to force her way into my house. Tattered, dark, clinging to her tall, thin frame like they'd been sewn onto her skin. Her long white hair hung in loose, tangled strands around her face, and those gray eyes locked onto mine the second I saw her. She wasn't smiling. Not yet. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, her mouth stretched into that same unnatural grin, revealing her crooked, yellow-brown teeth. And she ran. Not walked, not shuffled. She ran toward the stairs that would take her to my side of the tracks. I bolted to my feet, my heart slamming into my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. My brain screamed at me to move, but my legs felt heavy, like they were fighting against me. I glanced down the tracks. Still no train. She was halfway up the stairs now, her long limbs moving with a speed that didn't seem possible. Her eyes never left mine, her grin stretching wider with every step. I ran. Down the platform, my bag banging against my hip, weaving between people who barely noticed the panic in my face. My chest burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it. The distant, familiar hum of an approaching train. I risked a glance over my shoulder. She was at the top of the stairs, stepping onto the platform, her eyes locked on me, her grin never wavering. The train's headlights appeared around the bend, the roar of the engine filling my ears. I sprinted toward the edge of the platform as the train barreled into the station, the wind from its arrival nearly knocking me off balance. I threw myself at the nearest door, slamming my hand against the button. Come on, come on, come on! The doors slid open with a hiss, and I dove inside, shoving past passengers without a second thought. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to be away from here. As the doors started to close behind me, I looked back one last time. She was standing on the platform, just a few feet from where I'd been. Her eyes met mine through the glass, and for the first time, her grin faded. Her lips moved, forming my name over and over again. Ryan. 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 The train lurched forward, pulling away from the station, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. And then, just before she disappeared from view, her smile returned, wider, sharper. Like she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't stop moving. Even after the train pulled away from the station and I knew there was no way she could have followed me. Not physically, anyway. I kept pushing through the crowded aisle like I was still being chased. My bag thumped against people's legs and shoulders, but I didn't care. The blood roared in my ears louder than the apologies I mumbled under my breath. I finally collapsed into an empty seat near the back of the car, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down the sides of my face. My hands trembled as I wiped them on my jeans, my heart still hammering like it hadn't gotten the message that I was safe. But I didn't feel safe. Not even a little. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the blur of trees and small towns rushing by. The further we got from that station, the tighter the knot in my stomach pulled. I could still see her, standing there on the platform, smiling, waving, her mouth moving in that slow, deliberate way. Ryan. The image was burned into my mind, and no matter how much distance I put between us, it felt like she was still right there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. The rest of the ride passed in a haze, moments slipping by like shadows I couldn't hold on to. I must have looked like a maniac, sitting stiff as a board, eyes darting to every reflection in the window, every flicker of movement in the aisle. I kept expecting to hear that whistling again, faint and distant at first, then closer, until it was right in my ear. But the train was silent. Too silent. When we finally pulled into the city station, I was the first one off. I practically ran down the platform, shoving through the crowd until I burst out into the open air of the city streets. The noise hit me like a wave, cars honking, people shouting, the hum of life that never really stopped, and for the first time in days, I could breathe. Mark lived in a cramped apartment a few blocks from campus, but when I walked through the door, it felt like a damn palace. He was waiting for me in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a half-empty bag of chips in his lap. The second he saw me, he sat up, his eyes widening. "Jesus, dude, you look like hell." I didn't even bother with a greeting. I just dropped my bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, my whole body feeling like it was made of lead. "Thanks," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "It's been a rough couple of days." Mark didn't push. That's what I liked about him. He wasn't the kind of guy to dig into shit unless you offered it up first. He just tossed me a bottle of water and grabbed the remote, flipping on the TV like it was any other night. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel normal again. The city was loud and bright, full of people and noise and life. The apartment felt small but safe, like the walls could keep out whatever had followed me from those woods. For a few days, things were okay. I slept with the lights on, but I slept. I didn't jump at every sound. I didn't feel like I was being watched. The whistling was gone. She was gone, or so I thought. The rest of the summer drifted by without much happening. Before I knew it, fall rolled in, and I was back on campus. I lucked out and managed to snag a cozy little one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. Thankfully, both the campus and my new place were just minutes from the rail station, making life pretty convenient. It was a Thursday night, about a week into the new semester. I was sprawled out on the couch, a half-eaten pizza sitting on the coffee table, and a movie playing quietly in the background. For the first time since leaving home, I felt good, safe. I even laughed at something dumb in the movie, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. It felt weird, but good. Like I was finally shaking off whatever had clung to me back in those woods. I leaned back, letting the sounds of the city drift in through the open window. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout from someone on the street, the rhythm of a world that kept moving, no matter what. Then I heard it. Faint at first. Soft, but unmistakable. The whistling. My body went rigid, the smile sliding off my face like it had never been there. It wasn't possible. I shot up from the couch, my heart slamming into my ribs. I muted the TV, straining to hear. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, clear as day, the melody floated through the window again. Closer. I rushed to the window, my hands shaking as I yanked it shut. I pressed my forehead against the glass, peering down into the crowded street below. Nothing. Just people going about their night, cars honking, headlights flashing in the dark. But the whistling didn't stop. It was here, in the city, and it was for me. I told myself it was a fluke, just some random street performer or a weirdo passing by. Cities were full of people like that, buskers with flutes, drunk guys whistling off-key after a night at the bar. It didn't have to mean anything, but deep down, I knew better. Because that melody wasn't random. It was hers, and it wasn't just in my head. 2 days later, I had to go back to campus to pick up a book I had reserved from the library. It was a warm night, the kind where the city felt alive. Students lounging on the grass, the air buzzing with conversations, music drifting from open dorm windows. I told myself the noise, the people, would meant I was safe. For a while it worked. The campus felt familiar, like slipping into an old jacket that still fit just right. I grabbed my book from the library and decided to take the long way back, cutting through the quad to enjoy the breeze. That's when I heard it. The whistling. Soft, yet deliberate. I froze mid-step, the sound threading through the chatter and laughter like a needle. My stomach twisted, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, scanning the crowd. Nothing. Just students sprawled out with laptops, couples holding hands, a guy tossing a frisbee across the lawn. But the whistling continued. It was right behind me. I turned again, faster this time, my eyes darting from face to face. But there was no sign of her. No white hair, no gray eyes. I started walking, faster now, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whistling kept pace with me, threading through the noise like it was meant only for me. By the time I reached the edge of campus, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. But when I glanced over my shoulder one last time, the sound was gone. I turned back around and picked up the pace, my footsteps quick and uneven, until I finally reached the train station. It was late, and the platform was mostly empty. Just a few people scattered around, heads buried in phones, earbuds tucked in, lost in their own worlds. I sat on the bench, my eyes fixed on the tracks, trying to steady my breathing. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting long, shaky shadows that danced across the concrete. For a few minutes, everything was still. Then I heard it. The whistling. I didn't want to look. I knew what I'd see. But my head turned on its own, like I didn't have a choice. Across the tracks, sitting on a bench half hidden in the shadows, was her. The old woman. Her long white hair hung over her shoulders, her face half obscured by the dark. But those gray eyes, they glowed faintly, piercing through the gloom like headlights on a foggy road. She wasn't smiling this time. Not yet. But the second she realized I could see her, that grin stretched across her face, slow and deliberate. My blood turned to ice. She stood up, her movements fluid and unnatural, like her joints didn't bend the way they should. That's when the train roared into the station, blocking my view. But I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I was on my feet before the train even came to a full stop, my bag slung over my shoulder as I bolted up the stairs and out of the station. The warm September night air wrapped around me, but I didn't slow down. My legs moved on their own, pushing me down the street, past darkened shops and flickering streetlights. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, each step pounding through my body like a drumbeat. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I slipped into the first open spot I found. A cozy, late-night cafe with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. Soft, golden light from the neon sign outside spilled through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the inviting space. I slumped into a booth at the back, my hands still shaking as I pulled out my phone. The screen blurred in front of me, my fingers fumbling to open the Uber app. The driver was 5 minutes away. It felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes glued to the door, half expecting to see her silhouette appear in the glass, that grin stretching wider and wider. But no one came in. When the car finally pulled up, I sprinted outside and dove into the back seat, confirming my info before the driver could even say hello. The whole ride home, I stared out the window, my reflection pale and hollow in the glass. But I didn't see her. Not that night. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left the apartment since. Mark thinks I'm sick, some kind of flu. He brings me food, checks in every now and then, but I can see it in his eyes. He thinks something's wrong with me, that I'm losing it. And maybe I am, because the whistling hasn't stopped. It's faint during the day, just on the edge of my hearing, like it's waiting for me to notice. But at night, it's louder. It moves through the walls, curling under the door, sliding through the cracks in the windows. I've locked everything. Every door. Every window. But it doesn't matter. She found me again. Last night, during one of the 50 times I peeked out the window, I finally saw her. She was standing dead center in the empty street, motionless under the dim glow of the streetlights. When her eyes met mine, that twisted, rotten smile crept back across her face. But this time, it stretched wider than ever before, like her skin could barely contain it. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand and waved. I know she's going to get me. Everyone thinks I'm losing my mind, spiraling into some kind of breakdown. But I know. I can feel it deep in my bones. She's going to find a way into this apartment. And when she does, it's over. Either I'm going to vanish without a trace, or they'll find my lifeless body, frozen in terror. But no one will believe the truth. They'll blame stress, paranoia, maybe even suicide. No one will suspect what really happened. But I'm telling you now, I ran into something out there in the foothills of Appalachia. Something ancient, something evil. And it's marked me, claimed me. So if you're reading this, take my warning seriously. If you ever hear whistling in the forests of Appalachia, don't look around. Don't call out. Just get out of there. And whatever you do not whistle back.